Dear friends, I have the privilege to speak with Susan Blackmore. This is the original copy of her book, which she gave me many years ago. And she has a latest edition. Do you want to show that, Susan?
I would love to show
You
that.
are.
It's much prettier than the first one.
That's the revised latest edition. It's called Consciousness and Introduction. So Susan's a friend, and I've met her many times at the Science of Consciousness conference that is held in Arizona and elsewhere, hosted by Stuart Hameroff. And I'd just like to highlight some of the thinking that goes in these books from Susan herself. So, Susan, I actually surfed through your books more than once, and it's quite amazing the amount of work that's gone into this and the research that you have done. Share with us some of the highlights of your books and your views on consciousness. How do you define it, first of all? And
It's a
then,
very good starting point
and
because
how do you address the so-called hard problem of consciousness?
right. Well, first, a little bit about writing the book. So that one you have came out in 2003, and the one that's just come out was this April. And so I took it to Tucson this year. I saw you briefly there. And this was written with my daughter, Emily, and we did it together. And it's 700 pages and 2,000 references, and we're trying to kind of encompass all of the things going on in consciousness studies, but also be very critical, because there's a lot of nonsense really out there, which leads into, as you pointed out, the hard problem. So you asked me how I define consciousness, and one of the things we state very clearly at the beginning of the book is that in consciousness studies, the scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers, nobody has an actual definition. What happens is that we tend to go back to the famous Nagel question, which I'm sure you know about, the philosopher who wrote this paper in 1974, what is it like to be a bat? And the really important thing about that is, if there is something it's like for the bat's having experiences, then the bat's conscious. That's what we mean by being conscious. It's what it's like to be. So what is it like to be you now, Deepak? I think that's what you mean by you being conscious, and the same for me. And if it's nothing, it's like to be a bat. Like I would say, for example, this eraser here, what's it like to be that eraser? I'm not that sort of panpsychist. I would say it's nothing it's like. So right from the beginning, we have a problem. And if you say that a bat is conscious, then you're basically landing yourself with a hard problem. The hard problem was created, coined the term by David Chalmers in 1994. And he puts it in different ways, but basically it's how can subjective experiences, what it's like to be, arise from a physical brain, like a bat's brain or my brain? Well, I agree with a lot of people, and we wrote a lot in this book about why that problem is insoluble. It's not difficult to solve, it's insoluble because it's the wrong problem. You've immediately set yourself up with, on the one side, subjective experience, which is what you and I are really interested in, I think. And on the other side, the physical objects, which we can have endless kinds of discussions about, what the nature, well, maybe we will in this hour, about, is there a reality out there? And if so, what is it? But if you set yourself up with a hard problem, you've got trouble. So all through the book, we cover the evolution of consciousness, the philosophy, briefly the history of the philosophy, a lot of neuroscience, memory and perception, learning how these relate to consciousness. Does consciousness do anything? Is there free will? I mean, I'm on the side of no, there's no free will. That's one of the steps to my mind, a spiritual training, if you like, is to give up the thought that important me in here, am really doing things when the whole universe is doing it. But we try in that book not to put our own views too much in the front, but have them in there, their criticisms, think about this. Is the hard problem real or not? And then we have quite a lot about literary examples. Emily put those in. She's more of a literary person, so she put a lot of quotes from novels from old times about consciousness to learn about it in other ways. There's a lot about sections on meditation, and also, and I'll stop in a minute because I could go on for a long time, what's in there in all that section, which I'm particularly interested in from my own experiences of altered states of consciousness, drugs, psychedelics, that sort of thing, out of body and near-death experiences, which I've had myself and written a lot about, and how on earth we can explain those. And amazingly, the brain science is now telling us pretty much how we can explain those things. So we do all that. And then there's a lot of Dennett in there. And as you know, Dan Dennett died last month, no, April. And he was very critical in a, I think, constructive way. Most of us, when we think about consciousness, we just drop into all sorts of problems. We imagine this me in here who's in control. We imagine that things come into consciousness and go out of consciousness. But when you look at the brain, what does that mean? And we put in a lot of those kind of criticisms. So I hope that it's both informative and will make people think. And my last thing is we start with the word perplexity. If you're not perplexed, don't bother reading this. And we end with the word perplexity. I hope you readers and students who've studied it, are just as perplexed or even more perplexed when you get to the end, because consciousness is perplexing.
So I'm speaking right now to Susan Blackmore, and Susan, show the cover of your book again. We'll of course link it, but I want people to see it right now. I
hope you think it's a
yeah,
nice cover.
yeah, it's a beautiful cover, and Susan
You
has,
could say that's me and my daughter, couldn't you? We both
yeah,
got hair like this.
that's right. So Susan and Emily wrote that book. I got a copy of it last time I was in Arizona, and I've misplaced it somewhere here. So I picked out the old edition. Nevertheless, we'll have a link to this book and Susan's, all the information about Susan. The book is a very exhaustive compendium, as she said, 700 pages long, addresses neuroscience, addresses philosophy, addresses personal experiences, addresses the things that have been posed by Daniel Dennett and Thomas Nagel. And again, Susan doesn't pretend to solve the hard problem of consciousness. She just says it's very perplex. It is full of perplexity, and that maybe the whole problem is not even solvable through our current methodologies of science anyway. Science is based on observation, theories, experiment, validation, falsification. And Susan is suggesting, at least right now, if I'm saying it correctly, that with everything that we know in philosophy and science, even the definition of consciousness is not clear, and there's a lot of disagreement, and that essentially the problem is not solvable. And she also,
I'd like to interject there.
yeah,
If you take the wider problem,
mhm,
here I am experiencing what it's like at this moment, this world, the blue sky out there and all of that. The wider problem, that I think is soluble potentially to understand it. It's when it's put as the hard problem. How does this stuff called consciousness arise out of a brain? I think that's the wrong way to put it. So the way that I'm going, and I think you'll agree with at least the starting point of this, because we've had some very interesting discussions, haven't we, with Bernardo Kastrup and Anil Seth and so on about this kind of thing. And my own view, which they wouldn't exactly share, but we shouldn't be asking, is the bat conscious or is this brain conscious? We should be asking about the models of the world that they're building. So we know from the neuroscience that brains are basically predictive machines, controlled hallucination machines, making these worlds, but it's the worlds that are conscious, I'm saying, the models, not some physical object. We don't even know what the physical universe is, and you've had a lot to say about that. So if we take that view, then we can see, well, if I take a psychedelic, the models of the world this brain is building are changed dramatically. Or, and this is something I hope we might talk a little bit about, if you practice meditation for decades, as both of us have, the models you have of the world and of what self is, they change. And with that changes behavior, and the experience itself is changed through that kind of practice. So looking at it from that point of view, rather than trying to ask how consciousness is this stuff that comes out of a brain, I think we can get somewhere. And I think maybe we are beginning to get somewhere. I'm more hopeful, still perplexed, but more hopeful.
So there you are. She summarized essentially her take on consciousness, and very succinctly also said that we don't have free will, that we live in a deterministic universe. If we look at the laws of physics or fundamental laws of nature, that doesn't really leave room for free will. So Susan,
Just add something to that. You see, I think we could live in a non-deterministic universe with quantum effects and truly random effects. They wouldn't be determined. But the problem about free will comes down to what you think it is. And I think most people think that free will is something about me. This little me inside that I think so important, that me is having the free will, free of all the things that happened in the past and free of what the brain's doing. Whereas I would say, and I think you'd probably agree with me, it's really the whole universe doing it. I'm embedded in all this experience. This little me is just part of a story that's going on here. It's not the thing in control. Actually, it can't be. And there's no way the sort of magical conscious self or something can intervene in what the brain's doing. Brain's doing its stuff in a universe, and we can't intervene in the way that most people, I think, believe free will does. What do you think about that?
well, no, I totally agree with everything you're saying from a Western philosophical and scientific point of view. My personal training after I finished internal medicine was neuroendocrinology and then neuroscience. But I grew up in India and I was exposed to different philosophical systems. And, I once asked our friend David Chalmers, because he keeps talking about the hard problem of consciousness, which is an interesting phrase that he coined, as you said, but goes back to Plato as the mind-body problem, and it's been talked about by Western philosophers, Schopenhauer and Wittgenstein, and you name it. Everyone has been talking about this problem, mind-body problem, which is now called the hard problem. So I did ask David if he was familiar with any Indian philosophical systems. There are 6 schools of philosophy in India. One has to do with logic, and one has to do with epistemology, one has to do with ontology. But the 3 schools that I'm familiar with and I've studied all my life, after having looked at the hard problem from all the perspectives of Western philosophy, one is called Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, which is roughly translated as consciousness only monism. The other is yoga, which believes in a kind of a dualistic worldview. Mind and matter are 2 different things, but then goes on to say that matter is a fluctuation of mind. And then there's a third worldview, which is called Samkhya, which is kind of a dualistic interpretation of monism. So they are very complicated. And in that view, if I were to summarize my conclusions, and that's where this conversation becomes very interesting. Of course, practices like in yoga, at least, in the 8 practices that are very common. In yoga, one is social intelligence, the second is emotional intelligence. The third is understanding the body as a field of awareness. The fourth is using the breath to regulate the autonomic nervous system. The fifth is focused awareness. The sixth is meditation. The seventh is transcendence. And then, going deeper into what is called interoceptive awareness, knowing what is happening in the body. But ultimately, the goal of yoga is to actually get in touch with, and Vedanta, is to get in touch with what is called pure consciousness. So the difference right now, why there's no hard problem in Eastern philosophical systems, is they begin with a different assumption. Western philosophical systems, most of them, begin with the assumption that matter, what we call matter, is the ontological primitive of the universe, that everything starts with matter. And then we try and figure out, how do atoms, molecules, force fields, gravity, etc., the brain produces this experience that we call consciousness, and we get stuck. Now,
Yes, we get stuck.
let me finish, and
Changing.
then let me
Yeah,
finish.
yeah, yeah. Go on.
So I'll finish and then let you take over. So in these systems, the ones that in Eastern systems, I asked David, have you studied Eastern philosophy? And he said, surprisingly, for a professor of philosophy, he said, I haven't. Then he asked me, do they address the hard problem of consciousness? I said, they don't, because there is no problem.
Doesn't arise.
They
Yeah.
start with the opposite assumption that consciousness is the fundamental nature of the universe and that everything else is a human story, a human construct. Even the brain is a human construct. The universe is a human construct, and especially a human species specific construct. The interpretation, what we call objective reality or matter, is the interpretation of sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, sense perceptions, which are fluctuations of consciousness. And that in the deeper reality, there's no such thing as a person, there's no such thing as a brain, there's no such thing as a physical body, and there's no such thing as a physical universe. These are human interpretations of a species-specific mode of experience that we call Homo sapiens. That in the deeper reality, there's only consciousness, which is self-organizing, self-correlating, self-evolving, infinite possibilities, unpredictable, not random, but unpredictable, inherently
Yeah.
unpredictable,
Yeah. That's
therefore
important. Yeah.
creative. So when I was speaking to a while ago, unfortunately, a contentious debate between me and Richard Dawkins in Mexico, I quoted Freeman Dyson, the physicist, from Cambridge,
Yeah.
uh, as having said in his book that every quantum experiment forces the atom to make a choice. And he screamed at me. He says he couldn't have said that. He should sue you, etc., etc. So I wrote to Freeman, who was still alive at that time. He, as you know, passed away a few years ago in his mid-90s, and one of the most greatest physicists of all time. And Freeman responded very beautifully and elegantly to both me and Richard. He said, three riddles have occupied my awareness throughout my life. The first riddle is a universe fine-tuned for mind and consciousness.
Yeah.
Number two, the unpredictable movement of atoms. He didn't say random, he said unpredictable. And then he said our own consciousness. I don't know the answers to these riddles, but I have a feeling they're somehow connected. So, from an Eastern point of view, you and I and everything else is an illusion. It's a fluctuation in time of consciousness. The only reality is pure consciousness, which is outside of space-time, which is non-local, and actually experimenting with that non-local consciousness through meditation, through psychedelics, through altered states of consciousness actually gives us a window into a non-local reality where actually all the things that we talk about, out-of-body experiences, in-body experiences, extrasensory perception, are logically explained as illusions too. There's no such thing as out-of-body or in-body. All experience occurs in consciousness. How do you know you have a body? You're conscious of it. How do you know you have a mind? You can observe it. How do you know there's a universe? You interpret your own sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts as the universe. But in the end, there's only consciousness. That's a viewpoint that actually results in dissolution of the ego identity, which is the ultimate goal of what is called spiritual awakening. So there we
You're
talk
leading
about
on
two.
so far.
Huh?
Can I just go back to near the beginning? You've said so many things I would love to talk about in that.
Yeah, please do.
But near the beginning, I think you were implying that a lot of scientists are much more closed-minded about this than they are. There's been a lot of movement in um, I'm nearly as old as you, and that there's been a huge change in neuroscience. Didn't even exist when I was a student. Not
Yeah, no,
really.
no, I'm not saying they're closed-minded. The scientific methodology, which has been extremely successful, we are using science now to have a conversation on this machine that we call a
Yeah,
computer. So it's
but I'm
extremely,
talking about
but the
the people who
scientific
think that such.
modeling of the universe is not necessarily uh, the truth. It's a model, as you said. Everything that we talk about, even philosophy is a model, science is a model, theology is a model, religion is a model. But what I'm saying is the Eastern philosophical systems say no system of thought can give you access to reality, whether it's science, philosophy, religion, theology. You have to transcend thought in order to understand what fundamental truth is. That's all. I mean, these are different ways of looking at the world.
Now what I'm trying to say, I think, is that that is not so unfamiliar to a lot of scientists now. That in the
Yeah,
way it's changed during my lifetime. If you think about the psychology of perception, which used to be the sort of idea that out there is a physical world and the information's coming into my eyes and ears and going up somewhere with making a picture in the head, all that's kind of gone away, although a lot of people still think that way. So much more common now is to recognize that we don't really know what we're looking at. All that we can experience is the predictions the brain is making. This is the predictive brain, Bayesian brain kind of hypothesis, that what the brain is doing at multiple levels in this big hierarchical system in here is predicting what it's going to see next. And those predictions, one way of thinking about it, so that much I think many scientists would agree, that one way of thinking about it is this is what consciousness is about. It's the predictions we're making. This is the controlled hallucination idea. So the brain is constantly making up what it thinks the world is, and it's controlled by something coming in from where? And this is where I think you and I can talk about this. There's got to be something out there that makes you and I agree that, we've got this clever technology making this possible. But we can also agree that it's not a physical world as it appears. There isn't this stuff, it's not all made of stuff like that. All we ever have access to is our own modeling of it. But there's
yeah.
got to be
That's
something out there that provides the structure and allows us to make sense of it. And that's where I get stuck and go, I don't know.
okay. So let me share with you, because in all honesty, most people that I speak to, including yourself, have not actually studied Eastern philosophy at all. If
Well, I've studied Zen. I've not studied Hindu philosophy, although I've read quite a bit about
Zen
it.
Buddhism and Zen Advaita and Kashmir Shaivism all point to the same thing, and they
Well,
define.
I've been practicing Zen for 40 years
That's,
and
yeah, well,
going,
therefore it's easier to talk to you than say to David Chalmers, okay,
yes,
or to
yes,
Richard Dawkins. But
yes.
here's how Eastern philosophical systems define consciousness, okay? And I'll give you all the definitions. Consciousness is the subject of all experience. Consciousness is what makes experience possible. Consciousness
Hmm.
is that in which all experience occurs, is that in which all experience is known, is that out of which all experience is made. So instead of calling this an object, in these systems, they would call it an experience.
Yeah.
Before you can call it an object, an experience. And what is the experience? It's a perception, and then it's an interpretation of the perception, which we call cognition. Then you say, where is this experience happening? Is it happening in the brain? The answer is no. There's no picture of this in the brain, as you said earlier. Is it happening in the eyes? No, there's nothing in the eyes. It's happening in consciousness. So what is this? It's a fluctuation of consciousness. That's the logic through which these systems operate. And actually, consciousness is not personal. Okay, it is non-local. It is outside of space-time. It is formless. It is without borders. Therefore, it is infinite. Therefore, it is spaceless, timeless, irreducible, fundamental, and without cause. That's the Eastern perspective. Now, for me, that's very liberating because then I don't have to worry about all these problems because the liberation is also from the ego identity that I call a person, because the person itself is a process in that consciousness. In the deeper reality, consciousness is just modes of knowing in all species, in all modes of knowers, all modes of knowing, and all things known. But it itself is incomprehensible. If in the Vedantic traditions, the conclusion is if you can see it, touch it, think about it, conceptualize it, imagine it, perceive it, it's not real. The only thing that's real is the inconceivable, imperceivable, acausal, non-local, fundamental, spaceless, timeless, unimaginable, incomprehensible reality. So that's where we are.
Sounds wonderful in some ways, and certainly to imagine or think are both not the right words, but to, as it were, relax into that view, I think is part of what happens in this kind of training, even if ours is slightly different. But then why does the science work so well? Where does the brain come into it? I mean, the fact is when we do all this modeling and when we do experiments and we put scanners on heads and all of these kind of things, we find a consistent view. We find we can explain what's going on. So why does that happen? By just talking about this infinite consciousness, which doesn't have all this organization to it, it's without form and void, if you like.
Yes.
And
So
it is
science
possible
is
to
a very
experience.
successful model for creating technology and for expanding our experience of the universe. It necessarily is not a model for knowing the truth of how models are created. That's all. But, I have no problems with science. Scientific models are the most effective models in our age, and they've certainly gotten rid of a lot of theological and religious models. So they're very good, but they're still models. If I want enlightenment, I can't go to science for that. That's all.
Well, let's think about that. And here's a question that I've been wanting to ask you, really. So you've been training within the Hindu tradition and studying and meditating a lot.
I
I've
wouldn't
been
say
doing.
Hindu, I would say Vedanta, yoga, Kashmir Shaivism, and Buddhism. Those are the four things that all
Right.
agree on non-dual reality as the fundamental ontological principle or the ontological primitive of the universe. There's no argument. Science has its own successful domain of experience creating models. Now, you mentioned Anil Seth. And you and I are both friends of him. And, I watched his TED talk, which is brilliant, absolutely,
Yeah.
where he says the brain is hallucinating your material reality. What he doesn't say is that the brain itself is a material reality. So material reality is hallucinating material reality. It's counterintuitive, and there's a loophole over there. He should have said the mind is hallucinating, and that too, the human mind, not the bat mind, not the crocodile mind, not the mind of an insect with 100 eyes. The human mind is hallucinating the human brain and the human universe as a unified process in non-local consciousness. So
Yeah,
that's where we disagree.
we still talk about brains there. So I want to go into this question I wanted to ask you. So you've you've said where your knowledge is coming from in your study. Mine is only from Zen. I kind of stumbled across Zen. I was hunting. I'm going back now 50 years when I had dramatic, strange experiences. You might now call them enlightenment or mystical experiences and out of body experience. And I was searching. And I tried all sorts of things. I tried lots of stupid things. I trained as a witch and I read tarot cards and I gazed into crystal balls. And, that really didn't get me. That's a complete red herring as far as the real search is concerned, or the paranormal stuff. What I then stumbled across then, and I thought, I really want to practice this. And I have done now for nearly 45 years. Now, what is happening? Because I suspect that even though our training is different and the philosophy underlying it, okay, there's a lot of similarities, but it's not identical. And the kind of Zen that I do, you work with koans and ask these weird questions, and these and ordinary Zen, just sitting. You sit and look at a white wall hour after hour, basically, and sort of kind of like, what is this? It's a white wall. But we change. And what is happening there? So I want to know about the kind of changes that probably you and I have experienced in our lives that make us very different people. What has changed, and does it help us to understand what's changing in the brain, what's changing in the worlds we experience? What's happening there?
The
Are there some
conclusion,
kind of basic things?
the conclusion I've come to, and this is not my conclusion, it's, the conclusion of advanced yogis as well. No experience gives you access to reality. No experience, whether it's out of body, in body, mystical, scientific, because their experience is not the key to reality. The key to reality is the source of all experience. And what is that? It's not an experience. It's just the witnessing awareness in which all experience happens. Anything you can call an experience is ultimately a fluctuation of consciousness. That's all.
That makes a lot of sense of why they say it's ineffable, because it's rather hard to. I mean, what you say in a certain sense sounds completely nonsense or sort of nothing, doesn't it? But that's because when words spoil it, they get in the way of describing it.
Because as soon as you use a word, you're creating a model.
Yes. Nevertheless, I would say, and this is talking about experience, so it's using words and kind of getting in the way. Over time, there's been a kind of a shift in this thing here, this thing called the body, of not feeling that I'm inside looking out through a window to an outside world, but more a shift of there's only world, and that includes the body and the sensations and so on. So it becomes more unified, and it's like I'm not inside looking out, I am all the outside as well. Is that makes sense to you?
Yeah,
And that
the
is experience.
world, the body, and the mind are a unified process in this formless domain that we call consciousness. So yes, this body, this mind, and this world go together as a unified process in that which is formless. The formless is experiencing itself as the body, the mind, and the world as form and phenomena. And every form is a phenomenon, and every phenomenon is a fluctuation of a species-specific consciousness. That's the conclusion that I have come across, but it's not my conclusion. It's the practice that, in a way it's liberating, and in a way it's also the dark night of the soul, because in the deeper reality, Deepak Chopra is an authentic deep fake, basically.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, let's both be deep fakes. Nevertheless,
authentic deep fake.
Well, I'm not claiming authenticity for myself. Well, maybe I'm allowed. Do you think I'm an authentic deep fake too?
I think we all are. We are fictional characters in the collective dreamscape. And the reality is that which is dreaming. Wittgenstein, Western philosopher, said, we are asleep. Our life is a dream, but once in a while we wake up enough to know that we're dreaming. Yeah. But what is dreaming is not a person. what is dreaming is a non-local, formless entity in which the person is a time-bound fluctuation. That's it. So it is,
I wanted,
I've gone through the dark night of the soul many times, and it's like the razor's edge. On one side is freedom and liberation, on the other side is existential conundrums like who am I, and do I even exist as a body mind? But that it takes a little while to actually, ultimately, at my age, say, hey, at some point I've got to take the leap and take this ego dissolution, whether it's psychedelics or deep meditation or having conversations with Susan Blackmore.
what I'm getting at in raising this really is, so we can do science. What is
Yes.
happening to us in our brains when we begin to see things more that way? When we practice meditation a lot, we go deeper and deeper into this understanding, which I would, I'm not claiming to have gone a long way, but so far, what's happening? What's happening to this brain that is modeling worlds?
Deeper question is what is doing the science? Is the brain doing the science? Or are you doing the science using the brain as an instrument? How can a material object do science about itself? So, the fact that the object that we call the brain is actually a confluence of a field of awareness that appears like this thing that we call the brain. And that's the human brain, which is amazing, because that human brain allows us to explore the cosmos, send telescopes into intergalactic space, navigate other domains of existence. Right now, we're told that there are 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, uncountable trillions of planets. So how can this brain, which evolved over 200,000 years, actually even comprehend the mystery of existence? I think it's hubris for us to think that the scientific method, which, by the way, science is an exploration in consciousness. Experiments are designed in consciousness. Theories are conceived in consciousness. Observations are made in consciousness. You can't get rid of consciousness even when you do science.
Do you think that doing the science and asking questions like how is the brain changing when you do meditation, when you ask who am I, when you take psychedelics, will help people to
Yes,
become?
absolutely. Because the more you delve into this, and the very fact that in the last 20 years, we've seen the emergence of something called neuroplasticity or epigenetics, which means modes of thinking, behavior, feeling, emotions change gene activity in the neural landscape of the brain. That's a brilliant insight that has only emerged in the last 20 years of science.
Well, I'm thinking more about the science that tells us what is the nature of this illusory self. And when I say a self is an illusion, and I think you'd agree with this, but lots of people think when I say self is an illusion, they think I'm saying there is no self. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the self is a construct of the brain. And we are learning so much about that with the default mode network, for example, where when you're not doing any task, not concentrating on anything, the mind can just kind of go into me, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I wish I hadn't done this, kind of all selfie stuff. And we can
The
see that happening in the brain. We can see how I'm particularly interested in the body schema, which is usually in the right temporoparietal junction. It's like a map of the body. So we're back to models. It's a map of the body that's constantly telling this body, oh, this hand's here and this hand's here, and I'm doing this, and to keep the body in position. And goes wrong in outer body and other kind of experiences. That's then connected up with our memories and all of this to make this big picture of me. Ta-da! This is me. Now,
So
I'm
the
really interested in.
only change I would make from what you're saying is the only change I would substitute the word brain with the word mind. The brain is what the conditioned mind looks like as an object, period. The brain is what the conditioned mind looks like an object. But then, according to the scientific model, the brain is made of atoms and molecules. Atoms are particles, and particles have wave-like and particle-like behaviors. And in the deeper reality, even the brain is made of nothing, just like the rest of the universe is made of nothing.
And I'm not sure you gain anything by just saying it's mind. There's the big difference you've just pointed out. I'm not sure that you gain anything by saying that it's mind.
What I gain is that fact is that if I want to know reality, I have to get rid of all human constructs, including scientific and philosophical and theological constructs, and go to the source of all constructs, which is consciousness, working
But
through the
then,
efficient human mind.
well, what does it mean that you are going there? Because surely,
You means transcending the individual conditioned mind.
right. And
Over,
I was
you
talking
know,
about
the brain is 200,000 years old. You know, the Homo sapiens brain is
recent.
just
Mm.
that in an evolutionary scheme of 13.8 billion years of cosmic and biological evolution. And it is hubris, in my opinion, to think that the brain knows anything about reality. It's a material object. Even the brain is an experience in consciousness.
If we go back to one of the things we started with was about what are scientists at the moment thinking about mind and perception
Scientists
and
are
so
creating brilliant models of reality, period.
yes, exactly. So learning about those models is really interesting. And I think it's quite legitimate for me to be wanting to understand how those models of the false self or the illusory self are made. And that's what really interests me, because I hope that by understanding how those models are constructed and then thinking about how they change, for example, in meditation or in psychedelics, we learn more about how it is possible to let go of all of that,
Let
to
me ask you
accept.
something. Do you agree with Anil's state that the brain is hallucinating what we call material reality?
Yes, yes, yes,
Well,
I do.
isn't the brain a material object itself also? So material object is hallucinating material reality? That makes no sense to me.
It's only a material object, and I think it would agree with this, but we can ask him. It's only a material object in the same sense that anything is, and that is a mystery. I mean, that's a more interesting mystery to me than the hard problem, which just sets up dualism and you don't get anywhere.
The hard
But
problem
to
is the
my
wrong
mind,
question.
it's the wrong question,
Yeah.
exactly. So let's see if we can have a better question. And I think what you and I are here kind of going along towards is, okay, we can study brains while we know that all that studying is just building models of what? Now, clearly there's got to be some answer to the what. You and I can agree that, that we've got heads, we haven't seen our own brains, but we can agree that we're having this conversation, knowing that that's all modeled. But the fact that we agree with each other means there's something out there. It doesn't have structure and form. Like, it
Something,
isn't.
that something is inconceivable, imperceivable, invisible, fundamental, without cause, irreducible, and formless.
Okay. Now, if I take this in the Zen kind of, or the Buddhist view of form and emptiness, in which, I mean, it's said in the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. Form is precisely emptiness and emptiness is precisely form. So
Which
also our sensation,
fits in with
perception.
modern theories of quantum mechanics too.
Yeah, yeah. And it specifically says, so also are sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness. So all these things uh, they're not arising out of formlessness. They are form and emptiness are the same thing. Well,
Yeah. Form is the
why,
appearance of the formless. That's it.
but why does it? So then from a scientific point of view, I'm going, okay, I mean, from a practice point of view, I'm getting more and more kind of feeling understanding of what that means. But from a science point of view, why is it like this? Why do we have these brains? Why can we study these brains? Why is this kind of form there if it's all emptiness? Why this particular form? I think you've said quite a lot about the infinite possibilities. And so I want to know, of all these infinite possibilities, why do we get these ones?
Well, we don't get just these ones. You get bat ones and insect ones and dolphin ones and alligator ones. And, the innumerable species. What we are addressing is a very anthropomorphic point of view that the objective world is the human experience of it. That's it.
Yes, but you just listed a whole lot of things, and you can't list everything that could have been and isn't. And this kind of reminds me of like the multiple worlds, many worlds interpretations, because every time what you were saying about Freeman Dyson and the atom making a choice, in these many worlds interpretations, every time an atom does one thing or rather than
Who
another,
or what is who or what is interpreting?
sorry, what I don't understand. I'm just trying to
What
say
is it that what is it that interprets?
well, we don't know. That's what we're trying to get at. But the problem I'm trying to address here is if there are infinite possibilities, why is there this world right now with you and me talking to each other
This is
when
just
there
the human experience of the world. This is just the
why
human experience of
why the human experience and why frogs and bats and so on and
well,
not
well,
three-legged something
that's
else's? Why
asking
not all the other things?
the deeper then question is why is there existence? And
Yeah.
in the Eastern philosophical systems, awareness of existence is existence, period. They go together because without awareness of existence, there's no existence. So the phrase is called Sat Chit Ananda. Sat is in Sanskrit means existence, Chit is awareness, and Ananda is the supreme joy of the incomprehensible that makes the comprehensible possible.
Tell me something about this supreme joy. Where does this come from?
It comes from giving up your ego identity. It comes sometimes from psychedelic experiences. But it is actually the end of all seeking. You
But
realize
when you
that that which is seeking is the sought. That's it. And,
this
people like Meister Eckhart and many great theologians, including Teilhard de Chardin, said the same thing in their own ways.
But sometimes when you write about it, you put it in such a way that it sounds like you have to give up being you. That's kind of impossible.
I have to
So,
give up being Deepak Chopra, yes.
so
That's
how do we set about that when we're so hooked on the idea of uh, being a self who does things, which is what I was talking about earlier on, about free will.
in your words, reduce the activity of the default mode network.
Right. So then you would be happy to say that we can see these things happening in the brain.
They're neural
And
correlates of experience for sure.
so a
They're
brain
not
of
the
some,
source of the neural correlates of experience are not the source of experience. They themselves are an experience in
well,
consciousness.
as you can tell, I would agree with that. I think there's a huge, I mean, this is an interesting thing. We haven't got much time left, but let's have a little thought about the neural correlates of consciousness, because this is something, and you began talking about my book. This is something that Emily and I have written about in the book. It's become enormously popular, really, since Francis Crick had the idea. I mean, very sensible idea. If you don't understand something, but you can see correlations, look at the correlations, don't try to understand the cause until you've looked at correlations. But this led to a whole mass of science in the science of consciousness, looking for the neural correlates of consciousness. Now, this already takes you into the hard problem in a way, because it's implying that if you find something happening in there, then that correlates with consciousness. They have been looking for what's happening in the brain when I'm conscious of this thing, or when I'm looking at it but I'm not conscious of it, or when it's going on, there's a sound going on and I'm listening to it and I'm conscious of it, or I'm not conscious of it. And the implication is that this thing called consciousness kind of arises from these bits of brain, not others. So in the visual system, they would look for the neural correlates and say, aha, well, it looks like the neural correlates, statements have been made along the lines of, well, consciousness is not happening in V1, but it is happening higher up the visual system in V5 or whatever, something like that.
So,
All
as
this
you
seems
know,
to me, can I just finish a moment? All that seems to me completely wrong, because it's again like the hard problem, implying consciousness is this kind of stuff, But we do know that we can look in the brain and see correlations between what we're looking at and what's going on in there. I think we have to do away
listen,
with the idea that consciousness is separate.
if I read your book, it's a symbolic representation of your thoughts, and it creates an experience, right? So the neural
Yeah.
correlates are symbolic representations of experiences in consciousness. In our email chain, we have Don Hoffman and we have Christopher Koch. Christopher Koch, as you know, was a student of Crick, and he's given
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's given up on the fact that the brain is the source of experience, as you can see from his comments. And Don Hoffman wrote a book called The Case Against Reality. Whatever you experience as reality is not reality. And I think we agree on that.
Now, Christoph Koch changed his views a lot because of a psychedelic experience that he
Yeah,
had.
I commend him for being so flexible, even after devoting his life to Crick's ideas, which were very stimulating, but apparently
mm.
wrong. You know, a person can get a Nobel Prize in one field, doesn't make him an expert in consciousness.
It contributed to consciousness, though,
Of
Crick did,
course,
but I think he was wrong. And I was the last person to interview him about consciousness before he died. He was quite ill, but amazingly alert and
I'm sure,
alive.
I'm
This was
sure.
in my book, Conversations on Consciousness. And he was really sad that he'd solved the mystery of DNA, and he'd done amazing things about vision, but he'd not solved the problem of consciousness. I suspect that I will be the same on my deathbed, going, still haven't solved the problem of consciousness. But I was wondering about psychedelics. Have you found psychedelics helpful, as I have, and
I
Christoph
did
has?
LSD when I was 17 years old in medical school, so I have a long
Mhm.
history with psychedelics over the years.
But
I
did you go
was,
on then finding them useful, or was that just something that
no,
went
I
down your?
did I did LSD twice. I did psilocybin maybe 3 times, and I didn't feel the need after that because I had
Mm,
glimpsed those realities by transcending thought.
mm, mm, mm. I find this a fascinating idea that it's possible to find psychedelics really valuable and helpful,
Yes,
but then not need them anymore. So I haven't come to that point. I've been particularly interested in ayahuasca, of which, as you know,
which I've done also in Ecuador. I went through a shamanic experience, which was very interesting, out of body and all that, dissolution of ego. So I think psychedelics definitely have a role. But at this point in my life, I have not been experimenting with psychedelics. I only practice deep meditation. Spend 3 hours every day in meditation, and I meditate on my death at the end of the day because that's the next chapter of my life. So, anyway, Susan, this has been a very interesting conversation. We are out of time because we can't go over this period in our YouTube channel.
and
But
we're ending on death, which is surely a beautiful place to end.
well, death is the fullest awakening of pure consciousness. Death is the most alive state you can experience because it is the absence of all fluctuations, pure consciousness. And that is also called Samadhi in Sanskrit.
Right. Well, it only happens once, and not quite yet for either of us. Not today.
Thank you very much. And please, friends, comment on the video, look up Susan's book. We have a link to it. Thank you, Susan, for this very fascinating conversation.
Great. Thank you, Deepak.
Very
I've
grateful to you.
enjoyed it very much.